Welcome to UPSCpractice.com. Today, let's learn about the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, also known as the Amritsar Massacre, took place on 13th April 1919. A large but peaceful crowd had gathered at the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar, Punjab, to protest against the arrest of pro-Indian independence leaders Dr. Saifuddin Kichlu and Dr. Satya Pal. In response to the public gathering, the British Brigadier General R.E.H. Dyer surrounded the Bagh with his soldiers. The Jallianwala Bagh could only be exited on one side, as its other three sides were enclosed by buildings. After blocking the exit with his troops, he ordered them to shoot at the crowd, continuing to fire even as protesters tried to flee. The troops kept on firing until their ammunition was exhausted. At least 1,000 people were killed and over 1,200 other people were injured, of whom 192 were seriously injured. Responses polarized both the British and Indian peoples. Eminent author Rudyard Kipling declared at the time that Dyer did his duty as he saw it. This incident shocked Rabindranath Tagore, the first Indian and Asian Nobel laureate. He was shocked to such an extent that he renounced his knighthood and stated that such mass murderers aren't worthy of giving any title to anyone. The Jallianwala Bagh Massacre caused a re-evaluation by the British Army of its military role against civilians to minimal force whenever possible, although later British actions during the Mau Mau insurgencies in Kenya have led historian Howe Bennett to note that the new policy was not always carried out. The army was retrained and developed less violent tactics for crowd control. The level of casual brutality and lack of any accountability stunned the entire nation, resulting in a wrenching loss of faith of the general Indian public in the intentions of the United Kingdom. The ineffective inquiry, together with the initial accolades for Dyer, fueled great widespread anger against the British among the Indian populace, leading to the non-cooperation movement of 1920-22. Some historians consider the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre episode a decisive step towards the end of British rule in India. Britain never formally apologized for the massacre but expressed regret in 2019. In 1997, when Queen Elizabeth visited India, there were expectations that she would apologize, because that would have meant an apology by the British Crown. However, on a visit to the Jallianwala Bagh Memorial, she had said, "History cannot be rewritten, however much we might want sometimes or wish otherwise. It has its moments of sadness as well as gladness. We must learn from the sadness and build on the gladness." Former Prime Minister David Cameron had also visited the Jallianwala Bagh Memorial in 2013, calling it a shameful event. But he too refused to apologize, stating, "In my view, we are dealing with something here that happened a good 40 years before I was even born, and which Winston Churchill described as monstrous at the time, and the British government rightly condemned at the time. Theresa Mary, Lady May, was a British politician also known as Theresa May, who served as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and leader of the Conservative Party from 2016 to 2019. On the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, Theresa May said this:
"The tragedy of Jallianwala Bagh in 1919 is a shameful scar on British Indian history. As Her Majesty the Queen said before visiting Jallianwala Bagh in 1997, it is a distressing example of our past history with India. We deeply regret what happened and the suffering caused. I'm pleased that today the UK-India relationship is one of collaboration, partnership, prosperity and security. Indian diaspora make an enormous contribution to British society, and I'm sure the whole House wishes to see the UK's relationship with India continue to flourish."
Let us learn more about the background of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. The Defence of India Act, 1915. During World War I, British India contributed to the British war effort by providing men and resources. Millions of Indian soldiers and laborers served in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, while both the Indian administration and the princes sent large supplies of food, money, and ammunition. However, Bengal and Punjab remained sources of anti-colonial activities. Revolutionary attacks in Bengal, associated increasingly with disturbances in Punjab, were significant enough to nearly paralyze the regional administration. Of these, a pan-Indian mutiny in the British Indian Army planned on February 1915 was the most prominent amongst a number of plots formulated between 1914 and 1917 by Indian nationalists in India, the United States, and Germany. The planned February mutiny was ultimately thwarted when British intelligence infiltrated the Ghaddarite movement, arresting key figures. Mutinies in smaller units and garrisons within India were also crushed. In the scenario of the British war effort and the threat from the militant movement in India, the Defence of India Act 1915 was passed, limiting civil and political liberties. Michael O'Dwyer, then the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, was one of the strongest proponents of the Act, in no small part due to the Ghaddarite threat in the province. The Hunter Commission report published the following year by the Government of India criticized both Dyer personally and also the government of the Punjab for failing to compile a detailed casualty count, and quoted a figure offered by the Seva Samiti, a social services society, of 379 identified dead and approximately 1,200 wounded, of whom 192 were seriously injured in the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. The casualty number estimated by the Indian National Congress was more than 1,500 injured, with approximately 1,000 dead. Dyer was lauded for his actions by some in Britain and indeed became a hero among many of those who were directly benefiting from the British Raj, such as members of the House of Lords. Dyer was, however, widely denounced and criticized in the House of Commons, whose July 1920 Committee of Investigation censured him. Because he was a soldier acting on orders, he could not be tried for murder. The military chose not to bring him before a court-martial, and his only punishment was to be removed from his current appointment, turned down for a proposed promotion, and barred from further employment in India. Dyer subsequently retired from the army and moved to England, where he died, unrepentant about his actions, in 1927. Next comes the Roulette Act, which was an important act in the backdrop of the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. The costs of the protracted war in money and manpower were great. High casualty rates in the war, increasing inflation after the end, compounded by heavy taxation, the deadly 1918 flu pandemic, and the disruption of trade during the war, escalated human suffering in India. The pre-war Indian nationalist sentiment was revived as moderate and extremist groups of the Indian National Congress ended their differences to unify. In 1916, the Congress was successful in establishing the Lucknow Pact, a temporary alliance with the All India Muslim League. British political concessions and Whitehall's India policy after World War I began to change. With the passage of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which initiated the first round of political reform in the Indian subcontinent in 1917. However, this was deemed insufficient in reforms by the Indian political movement. Mahatma Gandhi, recently returned to India, began emerging as an increasingly charismatic leader, under whose leadership civil disobedience movements grew rapidly as an expression of political unrest. The recently crushed Ghadar conspiracy, the presence of Mahendra Pratap's Kabul mission in Afghanistan, and a still active revolutionary movement, especially in Punjab and Bengal, led to the appointment of a sedition committee in 1918 chaired by Sidney Rowlatt, an English judge. The sedition committee was tasked to evaluate German and Bolshevik links to the militant movement in India, especially in Punjab and Bengal. On the recommendations of the committee, the Roulette Act, an extension of the Defence of India Act 1915, was enforced in India to limit civil liberties. The passage of the Roulette Act in 1919 precipitated large-scale political unrest throughout India. Ominously, in 1919, the Third Anglo-Afghan War began in the wake of Amir Habibullah's assassination and institution of Amanullah in a system strongly influenced by the political figures courted by the Kabul mission during the World War. As a reaction to the Roulette Act, Muhammad Ali Jinnah resigned from his Bombay seat, writing in a letter to the Viceroy, "I, therefore, as a protest against the passing of the bill and the manner in which it was passed, tender my resignation. A government that passes or sanctions such a law in times of peace forfeits its claim to be called a civilized government." In India, Gandhi's call for protest against the Roulette Act achieved an unprecedented response of furious unrest and protests. Let's take a look at the scenario before the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. Especially in Punjab, the situation was deteriorating rapidly, with disruptions of rail, telegraph, and communication systems. The movement was at its peak before the end of the first week of April, with some recording that practically the whole of Lahore was on the streets, the immense crowd that passed through Anarkali was estimated to be around 20,000. Many officers in the Indian army believed revolt was possible, and they prepared for the worst. The British Lieutenant Governor of Punjab, Michael O'Dwyer, is said to have believed that these were the early and ill-concealed signs of a conspiracy for a coordinated revolt planned around May, on the lines of the 1857 revolt, at a time when British troops would have withdrawn to the hills for the summer. The Amritsar massacre and other events at about the same time have been described by some historians as the end result of a concerted plan by the Punjab administration to suppress such a conspiracy. James Houseman du Boulogne is also said to have ascribed a direct relationship between the fear of a Ghadarite uprising in the midst of an increasingly tense situation in Punjab and the British response that ended in the massacre. On 10th April 1919, there was a protest at the residence of Miles Irving, the Deputy Commissioner of Amritsar. The demonstration was to demand the release of two popular leaders of the Indian independence movement, Satya Pal and Saifuddin Kichlew, who had been earlier arrested by the government and moved to a secret location. Both were proponents of the Satyagraha movement led by Gandhi. A military picket shot at the crowd, killing several protesters and settling off a series of violent events. Riotous crowds carried out arson attacks on British banks, killed several British people, and assaulted two British females. On 11th April, Marcella Sherwood, an elderly English missionary, fearing for the safety of the approximately 600 Indian children under her care, was on her way to shut the schools and send the children home. While traveling through a narrow street called Kucha Kurichan, she was caught by a mob who violently attacked her. She was rescued by some local Indians, including the father of one of her pupils, who hid her from the mob and then smuggled her to the safety of Gobindgarh Fort. After visiting Sherwood on 19th April, the Raj's local commander, Colonel Dyer, enraged at the assault, issued an order requiring every Indian man using that street to crawl its length on his hands and knees as a punishment. Colonel Dyer later explained to a British inspector, "Some Indians crawl face downwards in front of their gods. I wanted them to know that a British woman is as sacred as a Hindu god, and therefore they have to crawl in front of her too." He also authorized the indiscriminate public whipping of locals who came within lathi length of British policemen. Marcella Sherwood later defended Colonel Dyer, describing him as the savior of the Punjab. For the next 2 days, the city of Amritsar was quiet, but violence continued in other parts of Punjab. Railway lines were cut, telegraph posts destroyed, government buildings burnt, and 3 Europeans murdered. By 13th April, the British government had decided to put most of Punjab under martial law. The legislation restricted a number of civil liberties, including freedom of assembly. Gatherings of more than 4 people were banned. On the evening of 12th April, the leaders of the Hartal in Amritsar held a meeting at the Hindu college, Dhab Khatikan. At the meeting, Hans Raj, an aide to Kichlew, announced a public protest meeting would be held at 1830 the following day in the Jallianwala Bagh. to be organized by Muhammad Bashir and chaired by a senior and respected Congress party leader, Lal Kanhaiyalal Bhatia. A series of resolutions protesting against the Roulette Act, the recent actions of the British authorities, and the detention of Satyapal and Kichliu was drawn up and approved, after which the meeting was adjourned.